And so when we talk about zero trust, of course, we are focusing today mostly on the endpoint side of the house. Um, so when I think of zero trust at the endpoint, the first thing that comes to mind is blocking unauthorized software, right? That's the easiest thing, the most straightforward thing that you can do is just only allow what's needed and block everything else. I promise you, the list of things that you need in your environment is much shorter than the list of things that you don't want in your environment. And if you go to sometimes I go to the AV Atlas website just to see like the statistics in AV in current threats, and I see that like week after week, thousands and thousands of new malware are detected. So since I started talking right now in today's webinar, hundreds of new malware were created. And I don't want to bat the security of my environment on a tool that needs to be constantly updating their databases to try to recognize these malware on time to make sure that they can stop that from running in my environment. A much more proactive approach is to block all untrusted software from running in the first place. So blocking unauthorized software is something that is essential for zero trust. It's something that we believe it's the core for zero trust. The other thing too that we need to think about, and I touched on this a little bit, is the applications that you already trust, that you already allow your users to run in your environment. You don't want them to be weaponized against you like the Microsoft Office was weaponized against so many companies in 2022, right? And that's where the concept of ring fencing comes in. Ring fencing is really it's a trademark product of ours that essentially allows you to place guardrails around the applications in your environment, where you can control what other apps they can reach out to, what data they can reach out to. Can they go out to the internet? Can they touch your files? Can they tweak the registry? Because if you recall here in the beginning here when I was showing you, by default, applications have that access granted to them. They can communicate with other applications just fine. And that's why in the Felina vulnerability, Word was able to communicate with PowerShell. There was nothing there preventing that from happening. And so with ring fencing, the intent here is to really limit that. Your Chrome browser, for example, yes, it needs access to the internet, but does it need access to perhaps all your files? Does it need access to PowerShell, the command prompt? So with ring fencing, you can limit what the applications can do in your environment. So they can do what they're supposed to do, but then you can also prevent them from reaching out to things that they shouldn't. I have other examples too, other than just the Felina vulnerability. I'm pretty sure a lot of you have heard of the SolarWinds Orion attack, and then also the 3CX vulnerability. Those were tools that people trust, that the companies, enterprises, Fortune 500 companies trust in their environment. But when they became vulnerable, what happened? They were impacted by it, even though they had the latest and greatest EDR and AV tools. And the reason being is because it was a new vulnerability and it was using a trusted application. And that application could, by default, go anywhere on the internet, really. And with ring fencing, we are able to stop this type of connection to take place. So for a lot of our customers, we were able to prevent the SolarWinds, the 3CX application from reaching out to malicious places online by default, and without even realizing that we were doing it in the first place, because we don't need to know that it's bad to stop it. By the time everybody else realized it was a vulnerability, that it was a malicious action, we're already blocking that. So this concept of ring fencing, I said, is a trademark part of ours, but really the concept is rooted in zero trust. Whereas don't allow an application to do anything just because it can, just because it has a default access. You need to think about securely configuring these applications securely and limiting their scope. This can mitigate so many different vulnerabilities out there because um, application hopping, living off the land attacks, these are terms that I'm pretty sure most of us have heard before. Those are super common ways that attacks happen in your environment. If somebody has access to your Adobe application, your Office application, they don't want to stay there like the Felina. They want to go to PowerShell. They want to go to command prompt. They want to go to another application to steal your data. So by ring fencing, you can really stop these types of interactions from happening in the first place. You can close the window and lock it. And also, the other thing that we need to think about here with zero trust at the endpoint level is admin rights. We local administrators is an issue. Um, so if you guys are like me and you guys want to take that approach of the principle of least privilege, you probably don't want to have too many local admin accounts in your environment, right? You want to limit that. You want to limit that to perhaps just your IT team. I'm pretty sure a lot of you have seen this before, but whenever I investigate some current attacks that have been successful, that have been impacting a lot of companies, a lot of times those attacks leverage a compromised admin account, an admin account that was easy to hack into. So obviously, with that admin account, they have more privileges, more access to do things with PowerShell, command prompt. So it's really important to strip away those rights. But we also want to think about efficacy, right? The ability for your users to do what they're supposed to do. And sometimes people do need elevated access to run certain applications or certain tasks or to run some updates. And I believe there is a balance that can be struck between giving the appropriate elevation without giving too much. And that's what elevation control is all about. Is you take away admin rights, but then you can also give the ability for the user to request access when they need that elevation. So if they need to run an application like Notepad++, for example, as an admin user, well, they should be able to request that and you should be able to give it to them, but just for that application. They'll need to give them a local admin account where they can go and to another application and run that as an admin as well. We want to make sure that you can give your users just in time and just enough access. So in this case here, if I knew what the user needed Notepad++ for, maybe it was just for a special project for the day, I could give them temporary elevation. If I know they're going to be using this application all the time and they need admin access all the time, then I can make it into a permanent elevation, but only within the scope of Notepad++, nothing else. So another simple thing that can be done to adhere to zero trust and to limit the exposure of admins by threat actors. So threat actors can't leverage those admin accounts to be used and weaponized against your environment. And of course, there are other things too that you can do at the endpoint level to adhere to zero trust. With secure configuration, there are a lot of ways of deploying tools, a lot of configurations that you can disable by default. So it's very important to have some structure in place in your organization on how you're going to be deploying that. How are you going to be installing software? Are all the packages needed for that software? What can be disabled? Make sure that you're aware of the security risks of the applications that you're installing. Patching is super important as well. Patching is something that you can do with a lot of different tools out there, and it can eliminate a lot of those vulnerabilities. And one interesting thing about patching is that a lot of times patches occur once the applications, those programs realize that there's a vulnerability. And sometimes they realize that because customers were hit by it. By the time they patch things, it's too late. So of course, it's still important to patch things, but if you're managing endpoints, you don't want to rely on when that patching is available. You want to make sure that you are limiting the scope of those applications in case there is the vulnerability. And until the patch comes through, you want to be protected. So, um, kind of like ourselves, we're not a patching tool, but we of course are advocates of patching because of all the risks that it can mitigate. Control storage, that's another thing that we need to think about as well. And I touched that just a little bit in the beginning. With group policy, what can you do? With group policy, you can limit which users can access certain places in your environment. But those users by default have hundreds of applications in their environment, and those applications could also be used to access data that has nothing to do with those applications. So, for example, if you have an accounting department, you probably want to allow them to have access to the accounting folder with financial invoices, with financial statements. But should they really be allowed to use PowerShell to access that data? Should they really be allowed to use command prompt to access that data? Or should they only be using their financial program to access that data? So it's really important to not only limit which users can access sensitive data in your environment, but also controlling wh- what programs they can use to access that. Because when you do that, by default, you're also limiting what programs a threat actor could use in your endpoint to access that information. You know, so an example I like to show is like a backup share, and you have a backup program. Perhaps you should only allow your backup program to access that share, nothing else, because there's no point. And just by doing a simple policy to say, "Hey, I'll allow my backup program to access my backup share," you can greatly diminish the risk that, your other applications would be used against you to access that backup share. And of course, we also believe in endpoint detection and response, EDR tools. And there's a reason why it's here at the bottom of the list is because it's still important, but it should be an add-on to the foundation of zero trust. Blocking by default, only allowing what's needed, making sure that what's allowed to run is ring fast or it's limited to what it can do in your environment. And then we have an EDR on top that can alert you of known indicators of compromise based on, the MITRE ATT&CK framework, CISA, what have you. And the cool thing about having an EDR on top of zero trust is that, um, like for example, the EDR that Turlocker offers, which is called Turlocker Detect, it can alert you of things that we're already blocking too. So if we see that an IP scanner is trying to run, our application control is going to block that, but our EDR is going to see that as a knock on the door, somebody trying to barge in. So it sends you an alert. So EDR has its place, but we just don't think it should be in the foundation of your security stack just based on historical evidence on how all these attacks are successful despite detection being there. So we see that it's not enough. It's still important, but we need to make sure it's in the appropriate place in your security stack.